This talk and accompanying slideshow were presented on June 21st, 2018 at An Evening with Frances Hodgson Burnett, hosted by the Knoxville History Project at Maple Hall in Knoxville, Tennessee. The event commemorated 150 years since the publication of Burnett's first stories, ones she wrote in Knoxville in 1868. The Marble Hall building at 414 South Gay Street didn't yet exist when Frances inhabited the town, but the spot of ground was part of the city's first baseball field, and perhaps Frances witnessed a game or two as she stood there along the dirt road called Gay Street. Throughout this presentation, you'll see maps showing the future site of Maple Hall in relation to Frances's known residences. She wasn't a native, of course. Frances Eliza Hodgson was born in Manchester, England in November 1849. The story has been told many times that her family moved to East Tennessee in 1865 when she was 15, at the suggestion of her uncle William Boone. He owned a grocery store less than a block from Maple Hall, near the southwest corner of Gay and Union, though by the time the Hodgsons arrived here, his business was basically ruined thanks to the Civil War. Boone found his sister's family a place to live in New Market, about 25 miles east of Knoxville, for their first year in Tennessee. But the Hodgsons would come back to Knoxville and become connected to Gay Street in various ways. Frances's brother Herbert Hodgson worked here for many years at the shop of Joseph Wood, a watchmaker and jeweler, and also played music at venues around town, including Staub's Opera House, where his Hodgson Orchestra performed the overture for the theater's grand opening in 1872. Across the street, her other brother John Hodgson tended the bar at John Scherf's Lamar House Saloon, part of what is now the bistro at the Bijou. And Frances herself attended parties, quote, at the Lamar House, where I think at the time all the balls were given, she later wrote. As a new bride in 1873, she attended an event there and wore the Parisian wedding gown that had been shipped too late for her ceremony. Frances later fictionalized Knoxville as Delisleville and Lamar House as Delisle House, the town's principal hotel where, quote, all important festivities were held in its long dining hall disguised as a ballroom. The Hodgsons returned to Knoxville from Newmarket in 1866, and aside from an extended sojourn in Europe, Frances remained in Knoxville until 1875. During those years, she resided in at least 5 different houses, a couple of which she depicted in her writings. All of her homes were rented, so she left no deed records, and while she lived here, Knoxville published only one directory in 1869. These facts make it difficult, maybe impossible, to give a precise timeline of her movements from place to place. Her family first rented a small white house along Clinton Road, about a mile northwest of downtown, on a ridge called Longstreet's Hill, after General James Longstreet, who 2 years earlier had camped his Confederate troops on the hill before leading them into defeat in the Battle of Fort Sanders. Reportedly, the hill remained scarred with foxholes and trenches for more than a decade. Deed records point to Charles Seymour as the most likely owner of the Hodgsons' house and surrounding property. He was a 40-year-old real estate agent who had acquired 30 acres along Clinton Road in November 1866. At that time, the small cottage sat mostly by itself on the hillside, surrounded by sassafras and pine trees and facing toward downtown Knoxville and the distant Smoky Mountains. Frances wrote, "It was not a very high hill, and the house was a tiny one, balanced quaintly on the summit, as if some flood had left it there on receding." She named the house Noah's Ark, and the hillside Mount Ararat. Her favorite spot on the hillside was a little thicket that lay, quote, about 100 yards from the house. Sassafras, sumac, dogwood, and young pines and cedars grew in the midst of a thick undergrowth of blackberry vines and bushes, end quote. One of Herbert's or John's more helpful friends cut a narrow path through the brush so that through the opening Fanny could walk, quote, as if through a gateway between 2 slender sentinel sassafras trees, end quote. She dubbed this spot the Bower and spent as much time there as the weather allowed. She became acquainted with a familiar bird which seemed to beckon her into the hiding place. Historian Jack Neely has written that the Bower may have partly inspired Frances's fictional Secret Garden. Beyond the immediate landscape, the hillside afforded Frances a clear view of the Smoky Mountains, roughly 30 miles to the southeast. She wrote, "One stood on the little porch of Noah's Ark and looked out over undergrowth and woods and slopes and hills which ended in 3 ranges of mountains, one behind the other." According to Frances's biographers, the cottage was a tubby kind of structure, with an L for the kitchen and a pointed roof. Its crude windows and doorways were practically covered with morning glory vines. The cottage had a door and 2 small windows on the front, 2 windows on each end, and a door with a porch over it at the back. It also had an attic room that Frances described in her third-person memoir as, quote, "a queer little room with unfinished walls and rafters where she had a table by a window and wrote stories in wet or cold weather when the bower was out of the question. There was no fireplace, and she used to sit wrapped in her shawl for warmth. She had a little cat, which always followed her and jumped upon the table when she sat down." End quote. Frances had enjoyed creating stories as a diversion ever since her Manchester days. But in Knoxville, the Hodgsons were poor, a 6-member family scraping by on Herbert's and John's wages. Frances had attempted teaching various subjects to local children, but her scant earnings made little difference. She was 18 when circumstances forced her to write stories for profit. She later wrote, "It was very necessary that I should do some work which might finally be a means of support. As I was shy about the venture of sending a story to a publisher, I wished to keep the matter secret unless the result was successful. I confided in my 2 younger sisters, and together we concocted a plan for getting the money to buy foolscap and stamps." How would she afford paper and postage for her manuscript? The Hodgsons' washerwoman lived at the bottom of the hill with her family, and her daughters often picked wild grapes on the hillside and sold them in town. So Frances and sister Edith picked grapes together, then recruited the washerwoman's girls to sell them on commission in the market, likely at Market Square, 1 block west of Maple Hall. The plan worked and enabled Frances to send off her first manuscript. Godey's Lady's Book published Hearts and Diamonds in June 1868. Miss Carruthers' Engagement, another story which Frances had actually submitted first, was published that October. The young fruit peddlers' identities have always remained a mystery since their mother, Aunt Cynthia, was the only family member Frances named with certainty. But now we know that the family was that of Abraham and Cynthia Gay, who lived on Clinton Road and had 3 girls, Isabella, Cornelia, and Florence, whose ages in 1868 would have been, respectively, about 13, 6, and 4. These girls may now be recognized for their contribution to the start of Frances's writing career. The Hodgsons left the cottage in 1869 and moved downtown. In 1875, Charles Seymour sold land to the United Presbyterian Church, which established Knoxville College on Longstreet's Hill and dedicated the campus's first building the following year. Noah's Ark stood adjacent to the campus and was known by faculty and students as the former home of Frances Hodgson Burnett until the cottage burned in 1900. 4 years later, Charles Seymour sold the lot to the college, which built a new house for the college president very close to the spot where the Hodgsons had lived. Harry Kanzler, whose mother-in-law Cornelia had helped sell grapes for Frances, eventually marked the Hodgson home site with stones. In 1941, a campus literary club placed a marble plaque on the spot, but for unknown reasons the plaque was later removed. For many years, a locust tree remained on the property that locals believed had stood next to the Hodgson cottage. A storm blew the tree down in 1943. This 1910 photograph shows the tree and possibly stones marking the side of the house Frances called Noah's Ark. As this next image shows, the site of the cottage has been pinpointed between 2 surviving structures on campus, the President's Home, built in 1904, and McMillan Chapel, built in 1913. After moving from Clinton Pike, the Hodgsons rented what Frances's son Vivian later described as a rather roomy but dilapidated brick house with a backyard running down to the Tennessee River. A family acquaintance remembered the house and its proximity to the water, saying, "We could see the river from the back door." Much has been said about this place. that it became for Frances and her siblings a bohemian enclave they named Vagabondia Castle, that it was the site of informal music performances and boating on the river, and that it partly inspired Frances's first serialized novel, which was later issued in book form as Dolly and then Vagabondia. She gives us a sense of the parlor's cheerful clutter in this opening paragraph. It was a nondescript sort of room, taking it all together, a big, sunny room, whose once handsome papering and cornicing had grown dingy, and whose rich carpeting had lost its color and pile in places, and yet asserted its superiority to its surroundings with an air of lost grandeur in every shabby medallion. There were pictures in abundance on the walls, and more than one of them were gems in their way, despite the evidence all bore to being the work of amateurs. The tables were carved elaborately, and the faded, brocaded chairs were as inviting as they were disreputable in appearance. There was manuscript paper among the general litter, a guitar hung from the wall by a tarnished blue and silver ribbon, and a violin lay on the piano. And yet, notwithstanding the air of free and easy disorder, one could hardly help recognizing a sort of vagabond comfort and luxury in the bohemian surroundings. It was so very evident that the owners must enjoy life in an easy, light-hearted, though perhaps light-headed fashion. And it was also so very evident that their light hearts and light heads rose above their knowledge of their light purses. Although Frances transplanted the story setting across the ocean to a row house in the Bloomsbury district of London, Vagabondia evokes the Knoxville situation of Frances, her siblings, and her young man of interest, Swan Burnett. Vagabondia Castle's location has never been identified with any precision, for reasons already mentioned. The 1869 directory lists the occupations of Herbert and John Hodgson, but not the family's address. However, a few strands of evidence may narrow down the location to a particular block. Around 1869, while Swan Burnett attended medical school in New York, Fanny sent him a letter in which she complained of the family's shabby life in Knoxville. Besides her chronic desire for, quote, an occasional new book to provide against mental starvation, end quote, she longed to live on, quote, a front street not close to the gasworks, end quote. In that one phrase, she gave us two clues about where she lived. Knoxville Gasworks sat on the riverbank between Henley and Locust, and Front Street ran past the gasworks and paralleled Hill Street, 1 block to the north. Descriptions of Vagabondia Castle are compatible with many of the houses on Front Street's south side, which indeed had backyards that sloped to the river. And then the census of 1870 suggests that the Hodgsons lived adjacent to Sam Logan, an attorney whose property sat on the southwest corner of Hill and Henley, and which extended south 1 block to Front Street. The Hodgsons immediately follow Logan's name on the census page. While other interpretations are possible, these pieces of evidence strongly suggest that Vagabondia Castle was located on Front Street near Henley. One early biographer who interviewed Frances stated that the home's, quote, tiers of wide verandas made it resemble a boat, end quote. Contemporary images of that intersection show several roomy 2-story homes with verandas between Henley and High, and suggest 4 main candidates for Vagabondia Castle. If indeed the Hodgsons lived on this block, Vagabondia Castle was part of the Williamsburg subdivision, bounded to the north by Main Street, to the south by the river, to the east by Henley, and to the west by Second Creek. Frances's mother, Eliza, died on March 23, 1870, and was buried at Old Gray Cemetery. 2 months later, Herbert married Swan Burnett's sister, Anne. That November, Edith married a local carpenter and moved out. And in early 1872, Edwina, the family's youngest, also became a bride. So by that time, the Hodgson siblings no longer needed one large house for the whole family, and had all probably left Vagabondia Castle. If the house was indeed dilapidated in Frances's day, it was almost certainly gone by the time the Henley Street Bridge was constructed in 1930. Today, a fragment of that block exists between the bridge, Front Avenue, South Broadway, and Nayland Drive. But there's nothing left there that Frances would recognize except for the river, the railroad bridge that spans it, and the view of the bluffs. The next residence is questionable. Some have claimed that Frances occupied a house on the northwest corner of Cumberland and Henley. She never said anything about this house, and as mentioned already, deed records and city directories are no help in confirming she lived there. If Frances indeed resided there, it was likely after her family vacated Vagabondia Castle and before she married Swan. The house has another literary connection. For a brief period around 1897, a teenaged Laura Tyler, the future mother of author James Agee, occupied the house with her parents and siblings. It wasn't known as Tinker Tavern until 1926, when it became a tea room. Sometime the following year, a brass plaque was placed at the house, designating it as the former home of author Frances Hodgson Burnett. But the honor was short-lived. The city had already planned to build a new bridge and widen Henley Street. Beginning in 1928, all of the houses and buildings fronting the street's west side were removed, and today only a couple of old homes remain on the entire street. No one knows what happened to the brass plaque. Another of Frances's homes was that of Dr. Andrew Jackson Campbell, who had attended Eliza Hodgson before she died at Vagabondia Castle. But the Campbells and Hodgsons had probably met when both families lived on Clinton Road a few years earlier. They became close acquaintances. As newlyweds, Frances's sister Edith and husband Pleasant rented a room from the Campbells, and this arrangement certainly resulted in frequent visits by Frances, who apparently boarded there herself at some point. Ada LaRue, one of Campbell's daughters, stated, quote, "Family later stayed with us for some time. I used to sit and watch her write," end quote. Frances was at the Campbell's home enough that Swan Burnett often called on her there. Ada said, quote, "Dr. Swan Burnett came courting from Newmarket. Fanny hid behind the door. She said she just couldn't see him. Her hair was all topsy-turvy and she looked a sight. I let him in the door. He patted me on the head and said, 'Little one, please tell Miss Fanny I'm here.' I didn't know what to say, but just then he saw Fanny. It was a long time later that she married him." This house was razed around 1932 for a parking lot. Although Oxford Street no longer exists, the site can be seen along a driveway between Locust and Walnut Streets, behind Union Avenue Books. Frances married Swan in September 1873. Soon afterward, they moved to a house on Temperance Hill, which during the war was the site of Fort Huntington Smith. In this house, Frances became pregnant, and her final trimester there coincided with Knoxville's hottest season. In July 1874, she wrote of her vain efforts to ease her discomfort. Quote, "I have suffered fearfully from the intense heat of this summer. I do not think I shall ever sing the praises of a summer in the sunny South again. I have positively gasped through the last 2 months, and I shudder at the thought of August. I spend 2 or 3 hours every afternoon lying on the bed in the loosest and thinnest of wrappers, fanning with a palm leaf fan and panting and longing for rain. I can't sleep and I can't rest. In fact, I can't do anything but feel profane." End quote. She gave birth to a son, Lionel, in September of that year. The Burnetts remained in Knoxville until the following spring, when they moved to Europe for a year, during which time they had a second son, Vivian. Their house on Temperance Hill may not have survived to see the city's massive urban renewal project that completely cleared the neighborhood in the late 1950s. Today, the approximate site of the house is marked by the Green Magnet Academy along Lula Powell Drive. In 1876, Frances returned to Newmarket with her 2 boys and stayed there several months while Swan set up his medical practice in Washington, D.C. According to one local acquaintance, Frances paid Knoxville a final visit in 1890. If this is true, Knoxville's main newspaper didn't report it. This was the same year that her eldest son Lionel died after a long illness, which perhaps explains why the acquaintance, quote, failed to recognize in Frances the buoyant, blithe spirit I used to know in childhood days, end quote. By that time, Frances had already gained widespread fame for her novel Little Lord Fauntleroy, published a few years earlier, which spawned the fashion trend of dressing little boys in velvet suits and lace collars. Even though most of her novels were written for adult readers, she is best known today as the author of children's books like A Little Princess and The Secret Garden, both of which continue to enjoy reissues in multiple languages. And while much of Burnett's work has remained in print since her death in October 1924, The Secret Garden is by far her most relevant work for modern readers. It became a popular 1991 Broadway musical, which saw a revival in 2017, and a successful motion picture that in 1993 critic Roger Ebert rated 4 stars and called, quote, far and away the best family film of the year, end quote. The novel continues to inspire film projects, including a forthcoming adaptation starring Colin Firth. The circumstances that brought young Fanny Hodgson's family to Knoxville also compelled her to write for profit. And while the city couldn't offer her the high life she enjoyed later, it provided her valuable material that she wove into her fiction. Her Knoxville years, during which she learned local customs and dialects, struggled against poverty, published her first stories, mourned her mother's death, celebrated her siblings' marriages, became widely recognized for her magazine writing, married Swan Burnett, and gave birth to their first son. Those years were not incidental. They heavily influenced her personal and professional development and helped her become the author known worldwide as Frances Hodgson Burnett. Accordingly, Knoxville holds an important place in her legacy and, therefore, a responsibility to help maintain it. But has the city accepted this charge? If so, it has only done so in more recent decades. Within Burnett's lifetime or shortly thereafter, all of her homes were destroyed. Some monuments were razed only to disappear without a trace. Columnist Ruth Campbell once complained that, quote, Knoxville, where Frances Hodgson Burnett lived, the city she called home, does her no honor. Isn't it about time Knoxville awakened to its duty toward the memory of a great woman? End quote. Her statement, though written in 1941, still represents the sentiments of many local Burnett fans who see little physical evidence and only rare public acknowledgement that the world-renowned author ever lived and began her career here. There is a marker down at Volunteer Landing Park, close to Calhoun's, a chunk of marble inscribed with a tribute to Vagabondia Castle. But as Jack Neely has pointed out, the stone sits a third of a mile east of that house's most likely location. The city now has its own secret garden at the Knoxville Botanical Gardens, a beautiful spot dedicated in 2016 to the memory of Knoxvillian Andy Ray, who operated a Market Square boutique called Vagabondia. Jim Richards, the garden's executive director, says that there are plans to expand the secret garden and make it a more visible tribute to Burnett's novel, with quotes displayed along the path and the hedges manicured into a formal garden. Still, I think more could be done to highlight Knoxville's literary past. Unless tourists happen to sign up for one of Laura Still's literary tours or pick up one of Jack Neely's books, those who don't know about Burnett's local connection are unlikely to learn of it while passing through. Those tourists who are aware of the connection may seek out our beautiful secret garden, as well as Eliza Hodgson's gravestone at Old Gray Cemetery, and the misplaced marker down by the river, but they won't find much else that has Burnett's name on it. How might we make Burnett's name a more visible part of Knoxville's geography? Let's mark Noah's Ark and her other home sites. Move the Vagabondia Castle stone to its proper location. Print up a brochure for a Frances Hodgson Burnett self-guided tour that tourists can pick up at Visit Knoxville and other venues. Maybe have something on Market Square that tells about Abraham and Cynthia Gay's girls selling berries there for Frances. Maybe one day we'll erect a statue of the author. We've made slightly more of James Agee, who has a street and a park named after him in Fort Sanders. But with the successful festivals staged downtown that celebrate everything from Dogwood Arts to Rossini to Big Ears Festival, Perhaps what we need is an annual literary festival that highlights all of Knoxville's most notable literary figures, those who spent formative years here even if their most popular works were set elsewhere. Let's make Knoxville a literary destination.